Think back to something you loved when you were a kid. Not something you were good at necessarily, but rather something you couldn't stop doing. Maybe you spent hours drawing characters in the margins of your notebooks. Maybe you took apart every electronic device in the house just to see how it worked. Maybe you wrote little stories, filmed silly videos, built imaginary worlds in games, or practiced the same guitar riff over and over again until your parents begged you to stop. Now imagine someone telling that kid version of you, yeah, you'll actually do that for the rest of your life. For some people, that's exactly what happens. They grow up and become illustrators, programmers, athletes, filmmakers, scientists, musicians, all built on something they started doing long before anyone told them it could be a job. But here's the interesting psychological question. Why do some people turn childhood passions into careers, while most people slowly drift away from them? Because almost everyone had a childhood passion, but only a few keep following it. And the answer isn't talent. It isn't luck either. A lot of it has to do with how the brain forms identity, long before we even realize it. When you're a kid, your brain doesn't think about careers. It doesn't think about money or status or practical choices. Kids operate on a much simpler system: curiosity and reward. If something feels interesting, your brain releases dopamine. That little chemical signal says, this matters, do it again. And if you repeat something enough times during childhood, your brain starts wiring itself around it. Literally, neuroscientists call this experience-dependent plasticity. It means the brain strengthens neural pathways for the things you repeatedly practice or enjoy. So when a kid spends hundreds of hours drawing dragons, coding tiny games, practicing soccer, or making videos with friends, they're not just playing. They're building neurological highways. Every repetition deepens the circuit, and over time, something subtle happens. That activity stops being something you do and starts becoming something you are. You don't just draw, you become the kid who draws. You're not just tinkering with computers, you become the tech kid. You're not just making videos, you become the creative one. Psychologists call this identity formation, and it often starts far earlier than people realize. When others begin to recognize you for something, it reinforces the loop. Teachers notice it, friends mention it, family members encourage it. Wow, you're really good at this? That sentence might seem small, but to a developing brain, it's powerful. Because humans are wired to protect and reinforce identity. Once the brain attaches, "This is who I am," to an activity, abandoning it actually feels uncomfortable. And this is where the path begins to split. For most people, something interrupts the loop. School pressure increases. Expectations change. A teacher says art isn't practical. A parent suggests a safer career. Friends move on to other interests. Suddenly, the activity that once existed in pure curiosity becomes tangled with judgment. And when judgment appears, something psychological happens. The brain starts protecting itself. If an activity becomes associated with possible failure or criticism, the brain may slowly distance itself from it. That's why so many adults say things like, I used to draw all the time as a kid. I loved making music when I was younger. I wanted to be a writer. The passion didn't disappear overnight. It faded under layers of expectation. But the people who do turn childhood passions into careers often share a very specific psychological pattern. Their passion survived the interruption. Sometimes it's because they had support. A teacher who encouraged them. A parent who kept buying sketchbooks. A friend who joined their weird creative projects. Sometimes it's the opposite. No one supported it, but they kept doing it anyway. And that's where another psychological force appears. Intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation means doing something purely because the activity itself is rewarding. Not for praise, not for money, just because it feels satisfying. Studies from psychologists like Edward Deci and Richard Ryan show that intrinsic motivation is one of the strongest predictors of long-term persistence. In other words, if your brain enjoys the process itself, you're far more likely to stick with it for years. Think about the kid who spends 5 hours building a Minecraft world, or the teenager who edits videos late into the night, even though no one is watching them. From the outside, it looks like obsession. From the inside, it feels like play. And that's the secret advantage childhood passions create. They blur the line between work and play. People who build careers from early passions often don't experience the activity the same way others do. To an outsider, a professional animator is working. To them, it might feel like the same curiosity they had when they were 10 years old, just at a higher level. Another fascinating psychological pattern appears here too. What researchers call the 10,000-hour effect, popularized by studies of expertise. People who start practicing something early accumulate massive experience before most people even consider that field. A kid who begins drawing at age 8 may reach adulthood with thousands of hours of practice already behind them. By the time others start learning, they're already deeply immersed. But here's the twist. It's not just the hours that matter, it's the relationship to those hours. When the activity began as childhood curiosity, the brain often associates it with safety, exploration, and personal meaning. That emotional connection changes everything, because when things get hard, and every career eventually gets hard, passion-driven individuals often interpret difficulty differently. Instead of thinking, "This is stressful, I should stop," their brain says, "This challenge is part of something I care about." The struggle becomes meaningful, and meaning is one of the strongest motivators humans have. Psychologists studying purpose-driven careers often find that people with early passions report higher resilience during setbacks. They've already been through years of learning curves. They're used to frustration. Failure doesn't feel like a signal to quit. It feels like part of the process. Think about a kid learning guitar. They'll play terrible notes for months, sometimes years, and still keep going. Why? Because the goal was never perfection. The goal was the joy of playing. And that mindset sometimes survives into adulthood. But here's something even more interesting. Many people who turn childhood passions into careers don't actually follow a straight path. The story we hear afterward often sounds simple. I loved filmmaking as a kid and now I'm a director. But the real journey usually looks messy. Years of uncertainty, side jobs, moments where they almost gave up, because passion alone doesn't remove obstacles. What it does is create persistence, and persistence changes probability. If someone tries something for 15 years, while others try it for 2, the odds start shifting. The long timeline becomes an advantage. There's also a deeper psychological layer here: nostalgia. Childhood passions often carry emotional memory. The brain remembers how it felt to discover that activity for the first time. Curiosity, excitement, imagination, reconnecting with that feeling can be incredibly powerful. It reminds people why they started, and that emotional memory can fuel motivation even decades later. You'll sometimes hear artists say things like, "I'm still chasing the feeling I had when I first picked up a pencil," or programmers who say, "I just like building things," or athletes who say, "I still feel like the kid who loved the game." That's not just poetic language. It reflects how deeply early experiences shape identity. Your brain remembers where your curiosity once lived. And here's the part that often surprises people. Turning a childhood passion into a career doesn't always mean the passion was obvious. Sometimes it was quiet. A kid who constantly asked, "Why?" A teenager who loved editing videos for fun. Someone who spent hours organizing ideas or building small projects. These small patterns can become enormous strengths over time. The problem is that we often overlook them because society tends to emphasize practical interests over curious ones. But psychologically, curiosity is often the first signal of long-term passion. Your brain pays attention to what stimulates it, and if something kept pulling your attention again and again during childhood, there's probably a reason. So when we look at adults who turned childhood passions into careers, we're not just seeing success stories. We're seeing the long-term effects of curiosity that never fully disappeared. The kid who loved something and kept coming back to it again and again through different stages of life. Now here's a question.